This is the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Welcome back. Friday, October 4th, 2019, the first sports podcast I'm doing here in October. This could possibly be one of the best months of the year for sports. I mean, there's June, where there's the whole NBA free agency and everything, but right now with college football, pro football, all these sports getting started, NHL, MLB playoffs, NBA starting in a couple weeks, everything really is getting going here in this month. And the thing that's on my mind today is college football, because I was looking around the rankings, I was looking at this weekend's slate, and my question is, I'm starting to think is it possible we have an undefeated conference champion miss the college football playoff? But before I jump into that, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms. It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud. Also, if you want to, throw it a rating as well. It helps to grow the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So by subscribing, you make sure you get a new one 3 times a week. So since it's Friday, obviously tomorrow's Saturday, and it's looking like it's going to be a pretty decent college football day. I mean, there's definitely going to be bigger days this year, but the schedule looks pretty solid. There's two top 10 matchup between 2 top 10 teams with Auburn and Florida. And I was looking at the college football schedule, looking at the rankings, looking at kind of just the overall landscape right now, because now that we're several weeks in, now that we're seeing some teams get their first loss, now that we're seeing some top 10 matchups, some of these big teams going up against each other, you can start to see some of the standings play out. Now, obviously, way too early. Most teams playing are only around 4 or 5 games at this point, so there's still a lot of football left to be played. We're only just getting started, conference play. But even with that, I know this is probably a little bit too early, but it got me thinking about the college football playoff. And even though there hasn't been a college football playoff rankings released as of yet, it's still always on your mind. It's still always on your mind as a college football fan, is wondering, okay, what 4 teams are going to get a chance to play for the national title this season? And as I started to look at it, and as I started to kind of pick out the teams and say, okay, who's still in it, who's not? I mean, Notre Dame, you would like to think Notre Dame's still in it, even though that was a close loss to Georgia, and they were able to beat then a ranked Virginia team the next week. They're basically out of it. I don't see such a scenario really, unless there's complete and utter chaos and mayhem that Notre Dame really gets into it. So you kind of have to cross the Fighting Irish off. You look at the Pac-12, and yeah, there's still a possibility that they have a 1-loss conference champion, but just with how that conference is playing out, how they're just beating up on each other, I don't really see anybody coming out of that conference. So you kind of cross that one off. And so those are kind of my 2 cross-offs right now, saying unless there's something really unexpected, and I'm talking like huge upsets throughout the SEC where everyone has 2 losses, same thing in the Big Ten, the Big 12, Clemson goes down once or twice. I don't see conferences like I don't see a conference like the Pac-12 sending a team. I don't see Notre Dame getting in. So those are kind of like the 2 things you can say, okay, that's not going to happen. That is not going to be the case this year. So then I kind of ranked and looked at, okay, what are the possibilities? And in my mind, there are 5 distinct possibilities, 5 distinct teams, rather, I guess I would say, that have the possibility of making the college football playoff. One is the winner of the SEC. The winner of the SEC is getting in. I don't care how many losses that winner has. The winner of the SEC is getting in. Then after that, I'm looking at Ohio State in the Big Ten because they're still undefeated and they're looking really, really good. They're number 4 right now. Then I'm looking at Oklahoma, number 6 in the polls right now, still undefeated as well, looking pretty strong with that offense led by Jalen Hurts. And then you look at Clemson. Even though they survived against North Carolina, I don't put too much stock into that game. That was way bigger of a game for North Carolina at home with Mac Brown than it was for Clemson. I look at a game like when they played Texas A&M, Clemson did, and kind of resoundingly won that one as a better measure of how good this football team is. So those are kind of like those are 4 teams I'm thinking of. But then there's this 5th option, this number 5 team that, as of right now, like the SEC champion, is still not really known. It's still just kind of an archetype for a team. And that would be the 1-loss basically 1-loss SEC championship game loser. That there would be a team that would go through their SEC slate go undefeated, but then lose in the SEC championship game with 1 loss. I would not throw a 2-loss team in here because I don't think that unless they were the SEC conference champion and that's just how much the conference beat up on each other, I don't think a 2-loss team is really going to get into the college football playoff with these 4 teams. I mean, there's always that caveat of, if there's utter mayhem, if, Ohio State gets upset twice, and Penn State gets upset, and Wisconsin gets upset, and Oklahoma drops a game to Kansas State and Iowa State back-to-back weeks. Just unless there's something like that, there is not going to be a 2-loss team in the college football playoff. Unless it is the SEC champion. That is the only case because the SEC as a conference is just so strong. But that then got me thinking, okay, the SEC as a conference is incredibly strong. I mean, look at the polls right now. Of the top 10 teams, 5 of them are in the SEC, including teams 1, 3, and 5. So 3 of the top 5 are SEC teams. And then number 7 and number 10 with Auburn and Florida rounding it out. So that means that there are 5 other top 10 teams for the rest of the Power 5, for the 4 remaining Power 5 conferences. We have to take out one of those because Notre Dame's number 9. So between the remaining 4 Power 5 conferences, they only have 4 top 10 teams among them. 2 of them from the Big 10, 1 Big 12, 1 ACC, no Pac-12. Getting back to that whole Pac-12 is not going to make the playoff conversation. So you look at that overwhelming strength that the SEC has, that you just look through these standings and that there are really, really good football teams. I mean, Texas A&M is 25 right now, but the only reason they're 25 is because the incredibly tough schedule they have to play. I mean, obviously they have that Clemson game out of conference, but just these other teams they have to play and just how difficult it is to really go through the SEC slate. I think they'll be really good next year, just don't have it all together this season. So I'm looking at these teams and I'm saying that, okay, that is just how strong the SEC is. I listed off my possible teams in the other conferences who I think can make it. And I looked at just their remaining schedules. There's remaining schedules for these 3 other teams. Clemson, they have 1 ranked opponent remaining. That's Wake Forest right towards the end of the season. Their second to last game. Wake Forest is 22 right now. They get them at home. There really isn't a tough competition left. I mean, they'll probably draw Virginia in the ACC championship game, but let's not pretend like that's a really tough schedule remaining. Oklahoma, they're number 6. Their toughest remaining opponent is Texas, but they get them at home, so that'll be a benefit. They still have to go at Oklahoma State, which is ranked number 21 right now, so they have some trippy, some tough games. I think the Big 12 is better than the ACC, top to bottom. Even teams like Iowa State and Kansas State, who aren't ranked right now, still have the capability of pulling upset, but still not a really, really tough remaining schedule. If you look at Ohio State, I would say it has the toughest remaining schedule of these 3 other playoff possibility teams out of the SEC. And I guess you could maybe throw Wisconsin into this whole thing, but I'm looking at Ohio State mainly because they look like the most legit non-SEC team as of right now with how they're playing. They have to they draw Wisconsin out of the West, which is really, really tough because, that's just the one team you don't want to be playing out of the West, really. But they get them at home, and then they end the season with Penn State at home, who, even though Penn State's number 12, they don't look that great. Michigan, they go at Michigan, but we've seen just how much they've struggled. They get Michigan State at home this weekend. I don't see that as a contest. I don't think the Spartans can put up nearly as many points as the Buckeyes. So Ohio State looks like they can run the table. So that's just a lot of explaining, a lot of going through the schedules basically to say that there looks to be 3 undefeated conference champions. That is not out of the question as of right now. So that's great. That we automatically assume 3, undefeated conference champion. You're getting into the college football playoff. Kind of end of story. That's really all you need at this point. That you run the table, you win your conference, win that championship game, and that's why the Big 12 added that championship game because they didn't want their teams to get screwed out of it. You add that championship game, and you get to the college football playoff. And then add in the winner of the SEC, so there we have it. Whoever survives the SEC, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma, if everything plays out. But I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it is going to come down to be that easy. Because I'm looking at this SEC, I'm looking at the SEC this year, and I know this is the narrative always, and I know it kind of gets overplayed, and it's almost redundant, and it's just annoying at this point, if I'm being completely honest. But it's annoying because it's true. And it's always brought up because it's true, that the SEC is hands down the best conference in college football, and this year especially, it is not close. You put Georgia, Alabama, or LSU into the Big 10, the Pac-12, the ACC, or the Big 12. Did I say Big 12 or Big 10? Anyway, you put them into any one of these other Power 5 conferences, or you give them an independent schedule like Notre Dame. I am confident they run the table. And that's not even including a top 10 team in Florida who, they've looked pretty solid. Auburn, they're good. Texas A&M, I just got done talking about how they're still a really good football team, and yet they just don't have, they're just kind of a year away, and they're playing such a tough schedule. I mean, even South Carolina, I know they got blown out by Alabama, but they gave them a game for a couple quarters. You know, towards the bottom of this conference, it's just as bad as any conference. I mean, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Arkansas, just teams that don't look that great this year. But at the top of this conference, it is just a murderer's row of teams that I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, in the SEC West, we have 3 top 10 teams in one division in football. 3 top 10 teams. Alabama, Auburn, and LSU. That it almost feels unfair at that point to say, what if any one of those 3 teams run the table and they then lose in the conference championship? How do you put a Clemson or an Oklahoma who played a tough schedule, but nothing compared to these 3 teams? Even though they're undefeated, how do you put them in over them? Because of the results of that one game against, again, a really tough opponent coming out of the SEC East. Now, I think the most likely scenario would be, in this whole argument, would be that there's going to be a team in the SEC West that has a loss. The winner of the SEC West is going to have a loss. I mean, usually we just assume Alabama and we assume Auburn is good enough to kind of get close but not really get the job done. I would probably say that's the case again this year. I like Bo Nix. I think he can make some plays. He's made some plays against Oregon. That was a big win. Going at Texas A&M. The really big games. We'll learn a lot when they go at Florida. But that's the thing is Auburn has to go at Florida, at LSU, and then 2 of their last 3 games are home against Georgia and Alabama. They're not going undefeated. And I think they'll probably end that with 2 losses, which is really not a stain on their resume that much, but it's just a simple fact. I think it's really going to come down to between LSU and Alabama to represent coming out of the SEC West. And there, while usually we consider LSU to be good enough but not great enough, I don't know. Joe Burrows is looking fantastic right now. He's looking like a legitimate Heisman candidate. 55, 45, 65, and 66. Those are the point totals that LSU has put up in their 4 wins this season. Now, I know that's not really against, besides the Texas game, there's not really against any strong competition. But the fact that the LSU offense can put up that many points and be that productive through the air, we've never really seen that. And that's a big way to beat Alabama, is to have a dynamic QB. That's kind of the blueprint to beat Saban's Bama teams, is have that QB that can make some plays. And I think Burrows can do that. So while I think the SEC West is going to have a 1-loss division champion, let's say the SEC West brings that 1-loss division champion. I would say either Bama or LSU at this point. Well, I look over at Georgia. And Georgia right now, by SEC standards, has the easiest schedule going forward. They host Florida, so they have a top 10 team at home. They have to go at Auburn, so they have to go on the road to a top 10 team, and they have to then host Texas A&M, another top 25 team. This is all after hosting a previous top 10 team in Notre Dame. But if there's any team I think in the SEC that has a chance to run the table, it is Georgia, and that's because not only have they looked so good, but in SEC standards, it is the easiest you're going to get, basically. Yeah, that's basically having 3 top 10 teams on your schedule. That's the easiest you're going to get in this conference. So if they were to run the table, if they were to get their win over Florida, go at Auburn, pick up that win, and then the next week beat Texas A&M. So they end the season undefeated, end the regular season undefeated, with wins over, at that point, 3 teams who are at least at one point, I don't know, we can't really predict how they'll be when they get to those games, at one point ranked in the top 10. And then they'll have to then go up against the winner of the SEC West. You're telling me that Georgia team that could lose by a touchdown to the SEC West winner, but has already beaten several top 10 teams, they don't deserve to go into the playoff, but a team like Oklahoma, who just ran through a schedule that was not even really a fifth of as difficult as Georgia. They deserve to get in just because they won a conference championship. And I think that this is a conversation that comes up a lot. But I think this is the year that's really going to get asked. Because in years prior, we wondered this. But at the end of the day, these other college football teams, these other college football conferences, while they weren't as good as the SEC, they were pretty close. But there was always good teams. I mean, the Big Ten for the past several years, with Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, and then they add in Wisconsin, Iowa being a tough team, Michigan State coming in and out of contention. They were always right up there with the SEC. I think there was even a year or two where they surpassed the SEC. The Big 12 has had some solid years, especially with Oklahoma leading the way. ACC, not so much. It's just been kind of Clemson dominating. Pac-12 has just kind of been a mess for the past several years. Notre Dame coming out back into the conversation. They kind of would shake things up in the playoffs. So we've asked this question, but we haven't really had to see it in action. Well, I think this is the year. I think this is the year that we're going to have to see it in action, where we're going to have to say, what is the most important criteria of selecting a team for the college football playoff? That, okay, teams ran through a not that easy schedule and they were undefeated, they won their conference championship. Do they deserve to go to the college football playoff? Because I know for non-Power 5 conference teams that they don't. UCF, prime example. How many wins did they have to get in a row before, they were even ranked in the top 10? A season plus. But this notion of the Power 5 conference, that they are automatically just so much better than the group of 5, I don't know about that one. Depends year to year. And this year, the ACC is bad. The ACC is a bad conference. I know they got Clemson, but geez, the rest of the teams in there? Virginia's the next best team, and geez, they do not look to be on the level of top tier contenders. They lost to Notre Dame, point blank. The Big 12, okay, Oklahoma looks really great. Texas looks good, but they couldn't even seal the deal against LSU at home. And LSU might not even make it to the SEC championship game. That's not great. The rest of the conference, Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, they look good. There's some depth there. Baylor even looks good. But at the top, not really that great. I already did a podcast about the Pac-12 a couple weeks ago. I think a lot of those points still remain if you want to go back in the feed and check that one out. But basically the point of that is that there's no top team. It's just a lot of that middle ground. A lot of that kind of, right now Oregon's 13th, but kind of that 13th to 25th in the AP poll, a lot of teams that just fit into that range, but no team that really transcends it. Notre Dame, they've looked good the past couple of years, but not good enough to make. They made the college football playoff last year, but this year that loss to Georgia, that's going to be the thing that haunts them. So in this year where there's one conference that's just head and shoulders above everyone else, I didn't even mention the Big Ten, where Ohio State looks like a top team. But Wisconsin, I think we still have to see them prove some things. Michigan looks pretty awful. Penn State, although they're ranked high, does not look as strong. Michigan State, while I have some pretty confidence in their defense, their offense, the game against Arizona State single-handedly gives you a lot of questions about that team. Iowa's tough, but not national contender tough, it seems like. So in this year where this one conference is just so much better than everyone else, is we're going to have to see how this college football playoff committee really judges everything. Is that it's going to come down to strength of schedule, how these teams look to the eye, the film test. Is that Georgia will have, if Georgia goes undefeated in the regular season, then loses to, let's say, Alabama, or LSU in the conference championship game. So they have one loss, and their one loss is in the conference championship game by, let's say, a score, a touchdown, a field goal, something like that, to arguably another playoff team. But they've already beaten multiple top 10 teams, and they look like they're a playoff team. You're really gonna put them in over Oklahoma? You're really not put them in over Oklahoma, a team who kind of ran through a so-so conference, but is undefeated, so we'll just give it to them? And while this sounds kind of harsh and this sounds kind of messed up, because usually you think undefeated college football teams, that equals automatic playoff berth, let's go back and look at some of the recent college football playoff results. Because if you look at that, you'll see that this point I'm making, the committee might want to start reevaluating this. Let's go back to 2014, the 2014-2015 season, first year this was implemented. Florida State was the number 3 seed because they were an undefeated conference champion. Got absolutely blown out 59-20 in the Rose Bowl by Oregon in the semifinal. Next year, Michigan State, they got in because they were a conference champion and only had one loss. They faced up against Alabama 38-0. Alabama was the 2 seed, Michigan State the 3, and yet there was a 38-0 difference between those teams. That means that somebody got something wrong in that committee. Next season, number 2 versus number 3 again. Ohio State, one-loss conference champion, 31-0. Loss in that semifinal. You can just keep on going. I mean, the next season, there was the double overtime thriller where Georgia got past Oklahoma. That was interesting. Alabama beat Clemson 24-6 in a tough game. So that was a year they got it right. But the next season, last year, Notre Dame gets in because they're undefeated. They're 12-0. Well, they'll go up against the number 2 team, 30-3, and it wasn't that close. So I look, and these are a lot of these games are the number 2 versus the number 3, which are all of these games I mentioned actually were the number 2 versus number 3. These games that are supposed to be the closest games, and yet they aren't. And what I see that as somebody, as a committee, making a mistake, mistaking what to value when judging for a national title. Because if they were making the right valuation picks, these games would be closer. These national semifinal games would be worth playing. Because you got to be kidding me. If teams are winning 38-0, 31-0, and 30-3, is that really worth playing? Did we really need to see that? I mean, let's go back to that year, 2015. Did we really need to see Alabama beat up on Michigan State to know that Alabama was head and shoulders a better football team? How about that Clemson team that dismantled Ohio State? Did we need to see that? Last year's Clemson team, arguably one of the best in college football history. Did anybody really give them a chance against Notre Dame going into that one? I don't think so. I don't remember it that way. I kind of remember looking at that game going, yeah, that's certainly going to be an interesting one. I probably won't watch the full one because it's just going to be that bad. So, if you're having national semifinal games to play for the national title, be that bad, be that much of a blowout, I see that as the committee's fault. I see that as the committee overvaluing certain aspects and undervaluing the correct ones. That you have to, as the committee, look back on history and say, okay, we've messed up. We are messing up. We are putting in teams that don't deserve to be there. Maybe strength of schedule and maybe eye test need to play a bigger role. I mean, people are put on this college football committee that are legendary coaches and talent evaluators and people within the game that know the game better than anyone else. That's why they're put on there. And yet we don't trust them to use the eye test to pick the right teams. And I know that it's a scary thought because you look at the eye test and you say, oh, well, you can then just argue almost anything you want, that this team looks better beating up Northwestern State. I mean, yeah, the SEC, they have some of the worst non-conference games. I mean, this year was kind of surprising with how many good non-conference matchups they had, with Texas A&M playing Clemson and Auburn playing Oregon and LSU playing Texas. But if we're being completely honest, there is no conference that is more guilty of scheduling FCS opponents and just easy games than the SEC. The reason for that is because of the overwhelming strength of their conference. And while I said before, usually it's a difference, but it's, you could still make the argument for other conferences. This year it is no difference. There was no argument whatsoever. The difference is so great that you're going to have to look at this committee and say, we've messed up before. We have messed up picking these games before, picking the teams that deserve to go in. That if there is a one-loss team in the SEC that just didn't win their conference championship and that's their only loss, maybe we put them in over a team like Oklahoma that's looked good but not great, that not up to the level of a Georgia team who ran through a really difficult schedule but just couldn't get past an SEC West champion who is probably arguably the best team in the country. That's all I'm saying, is that consideration has to happen. That, yes, maybe, While I would like this, while a 2-loss Georgia team could theoretically be a better football team than Oklahoma, an undefeated Oklahoma team, unless Oklahoma has 1 loss, I don't see, or a conference champion has 1 loss, I don't see that 2 loss over 1 loss really playing out. And like I said, I don't see 2 losses getting you in a college football playoff unless there's absolute mayhem. And I agree with that because 1 loss, that's just 1 game you kind of had a misstep in. Just couldn't get enough. 2 losses, that's something completely different in college football. But my argument is a 1-loss non-conference champion out of the SEC is really, really impressive this year. More impressive than years past when considering the rest of the college football landscape. And in my eyes, I think that's more I think that would actually be more impressive than an undefeated conference champion out of any of these other Power 5 conferences. Well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, rate this podcast if you like it on your favorite platforms, as well as subscribe, because there's new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And next week, have a lot more cooler plans coming up for the podcast, so stay tuned for that. We're trying to bring on some guests back. Also, for more episodes of this podcast, as well as my music podcast and my interview series, Anything Goes with Jackson Neill, go over to jacksonneillpodcasts.com. There's a link to that in the show notes. There is an archive of all the episodes I have published, as well as the new ones, just kind of a cool go-to spot if you want to check out all of the podcasts that I am publishing. Now, if you're a really big fan of the show, if you really can't get enough, go over to Patreon. There, for just a couple dollars a month, or even $1 a month, not just $1 a month, you can get access to cool bonus content from this podcast, my music one, as well as my interview series. So, link to that down in the show notes if you want to check that out, because I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support allows me to spend more time on these, making cool episodes for you guys. Now, if you want to stay up to date on everything I'm doing, all the podcasts I publish, all that good stuff, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeill20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Well, thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.